conversationalist and deeply committed to affordable housing in Arlington County. AHS is proud to continue this annual gathering of sharing cutting-edge ideas and practical solutions for moving forward. Before joining AHS, I spent several years working in education, from teaching kindergarten classes and serving as a special education attorney to representing the education ministry of the Australian government. In those roles, I learned firsthand how education is the starting point from which we begin to solve society's most daunting challenges. I was so honored to be asked to lead AHS and work with its marvelous board and our great staff and volunteers, because integral to AHS's mission is its commitment to provide education opportunities that foster our community's values, our community's drive to increase the supply of affordable housing in Arlington County and Northern Virginia. Today's forum will do just that. As with you here and those joining us online, I look forward to hearing from Jenny Schuetz, our from Brookings Metro, and Carmen Romero of APA, as they share their thoughts with us on America's housing crisis and pathways to a better tomorrow for the nation and for us here in Arlington. Guiding us through today's conversation, our MC, will be AHS's Secretary and Vice Chair, Laura Martin. Reverend Laura Martin is Associate Pastor of Rock Spring Congregational United Church of Christ. Born among the fresh blackberries of Southwest Virginia. It's true, those are some good blackberries in Southwest Virginia. She began her life in service while studying at the University of Virginia, when, during a spring break service trip, she felt the calling to work with those experiencing homelessness. After this trip, she continued her work with those experiencing housing insecurity and mental health issues, leading her to begin classes at Wesley Theological Seminary. It was here that she transitioned to working with families experiencing housing insecurity in a range of housing programs. Drawn to Rock Spring Church for its dynamic social action work, its provocative preaching, creative worship, justice leading, and music. I've heard the music, it's good, it's good. Laura excitedly joined first as an intern in 2012, then as a staff member in 2015. In addition to serving as associate pastor, her many community contributions include serving on the steering committee of the Arlington Interfaith Network, the UCC Palestine-Israel Network, and on the steering committee of Interfaith Power and Light. Ladies and gentlemen, the light of our board and our MC for this afternoon, Laura Martin. Laura.
Good afternoon, and you can see why we hired Charles. His energy, his positive spirit, his ability to look for the good and to make it real, all made him stand out among our candidates, and we are so delighted to have him in the role of Executive Director. We're also delighted to have all of you joining us, whether you are one of the about 50-some people watching online today. You are just as much a part of this as those of you who we are so fortunate to have here in the room. We are grateful to the Church at Clarendon and Reverend Danielle Bridgeforth for the tremendous hospitality extended to us today. So I have the privilege of introducing our two guest speakers today, and then following our speakers and some remarks that they have, we get to have a conversation with them. Think talk show style without any of the drama of Jerry Springer types of shows. So you should have received an index card when you signed in, and we invite you to write down a question that you may have for our presenters, and those will be collected, and we'll have an opportunity later in the program. If you're online and you have a question you'd like to offer, feel free to write it in the chat, or you can email it to contact@allianceforhousingsolutions.org. Again, that's contact@allianceforhousingsolutions.org. And now to our speakers. We are thrilled to have Dr. Jenny Schuetz, who is a senior fellow at Brookings Metro and an expert in urban economics and housing policy. Dr. Schuetz has written numerous peer-reviewed journal articles on land use regulation, housing prices, urban amenities, and neighborhood change. She's appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, PBS NewsHour, The Indicator podcast, Vox, and Slate. And she's written a book that many of you have read or have heard about. It's called Fixer Upper: How to Repair America's Broken Housing Systems. And her topics of recent research include how statewide zoning reform could improve housing affordability, local strategies to help renters during the COVID crisis, rethinking home ownership incentives to narrow the racial wealth gap, and how housing costs contribute to economic and racial segregation. Before joining Brookings, she served as principal economist at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. She was also an assistant professor at the University of Southern California and a postdoc fellow at NYU Furman. She's now a senior fellow at George Washington University Center for Washington Area Studies, and she teaches in Georgetown's urban planning program. She earned her PhD in public policy from Harvard, a master's in city planning from MIT, and a BA with highest distinction in economics and political and social thought from the University of Virginia. We are so delighted to have you with us today. Our second presenter is Ms. Carmen Romero, who became president and CEO of the Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing in July 2021. Ms. Romero joined APA in 2011, and she spent the last decade overseeing the real estate team contributing to the creation or preservation of, listen to this number, more than 1,000 new affordable housing units in the DC region, with additional developments underway today in Arlington, Fairfax, Loudoun, and Montgomery counties. And if you're here today, you know how much we need those units. Under her leadership, APA's real estate development team has delivered several innovative and award-winning affordable housing properties. You likely know Queens Court, Gilliam Place, Columbia Hills, and the Springs. And in addition, she's overseeing APA's projects that are under active construction in Arlington. These include this innovative partnership with the American Legion Post and a joint venture with E&G Group that's developing 98 units of affordable senior housing in Loudoun County. Prior to joining APA, Ms. Romero was Director of Real Estate Development and Public-Private Partnerships at Clark Construction. She began her career at Marriott International. She has her MBA in Finance from the Wharton School of Business and her bachelor's degree in Foreign Service from Georgetown. Her affiliations include the Housing Partnership Network, Columbia Pike Partnership, Tyson's Partnership, Enterprise Community Leadership Council, and she was the past chair of the Virginia Latino Advisory Board. And now we welcome Dr. Jenny Schuetz for her presentation.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. It's lovely to be across the river, to get to come over and talk to you. I live in DC, but I have been eagerly following a lot of the Arlington County activities going on, the debate over missing middle. So I'm going to give you some of the highlights from my book, which is very much a national framing of the housing affordability crisis. But everything I'm going to say to you that is true in the national context is also true in the local context in Arlington and very much also in the regional context. You may recognize this gentleman from his frequent appearances on YouTube. This is Jimmy McMillan. He is based in New York City and is the head of the Rent is Too Damn High party. New York is one of those wonderful cities where you have lots of small parties that run in local elections, and he is a single issue party, and it's a pretty important message. So I think none of us would have any trouble believing that the rent is too damn high in New York City.
A little closer to the mic and see if that picks up.
All right, is that better? Yes. Excellent. So I think none of us would be shocked to find out that the rent is too damn high in New York City, but it turns out the rent is too damn high in Arlington, it's too damn high in Montgomery County and Fairfax, it's too damn high almost everywhere in the US at this point. And this is really the large context for my book, is thinking about how did we get to this point where rent and mortgage costs are so high that many middle-income families can't afford it in communities that historically have been fairly affordable. So if we go back a little bit to think about some historical context, this graph is showing you housing production normalized by population going back to about 1970. And what we can see that housing production is very cyclical. It goes up and down over time, but it's been on a downward trend for a while. And we got ourselves into deep trouble in the Great Recession. So when the foreclosure crisis hit, the demand for housing dried up because people lost their jobs, people couldn't qualify for mortgages, kids weren't moving out of their parents' basement because they couldn't get a job and pay the rent someplace. So we stopped building homes altogether for about 4 or 5 years. Coming out of the Great Recession, we gradually started picking up, but we are essentially a decade in the hole of housing construction for the entire country. Now that problem is even longer and even deeper when we look at some of the metro areas that have the strongest job markets. So places like New York, Boston, the entire West Coast from Los Angeles to Seattle, those places haven't been building enough homes for more like 30 or 40 years, which just leaves us without enough homes to keep up with population growth and job growth. The DC region, this is about 15 years in the making. If I were to show you a similar graph, it actually starts before the Great Recession. Montgomery and Fairfax counties stopped building homes in about the mid-2000s and have never really caught up. And so the region overall has a serious shortage of just the number of homes to accommodate population growth. Now, it's not that this is some magical natural outcome of markets. Our shortage of homes is very much caused by policies and rules that we have created and imposed on ourselves. So many of the policies that local governments administer, things like zoning codes, have made it impossible to add enough housing in the places with the highest demand, where people most want to live. Our zoning code, not just in Arlington, but in most of the country, prohibits building anything except single-family detached houses on the majority of land. Even in big cities, I mean, Arlington is an urban county, the district is a city, we have reserved more than half of our land in urban communities for single-family detached houses, which take up the most amount of space and are the most expensive structure types to buy or to rent. We have prohibited things like townhouses, duplexes, fourplexes, let alone apartment buildings on the majority of our land. Right? And many of our neighborhoods, like Arlington, like Northwest DC, were developed in the 40s, 50s, and 60s as single-family homes. It's illegal to replace those homes now with anything that's larger, that has more units. So we have made it impossible to add any additional housing in many of these areas that no longer have open space. The only way we are going to add housing is if we change the underlying rules. This is in the book, by the way. This is not just for missing middle, but it fits very nicely. If we can look at lots of pictures of pre-zoning neighborhoods and see the kinds of communities that we used to create as of right, where you were just allowed to build these structures. So places like the West Village in New York City, which is one of the most charming and beloved neighborhoods. This shows up in movies, this shows up on posters, and you can see that we have a diversity of buildings. So you have taller and shorter buildings next to each other. The buildings come right up to the street edge so that you have connection between the sidewalk and the buildings. You have funny-shaped buildings to meet where funny-shaped roads come into conjunction, so you have little triangular buildings. This all adds character to the neighborhood. This makes it a charming and delightful place to live. All of this was built pre-zoning, and most of it couldn't be built today if it burned down and had to be replaced. Many of our neighborhoods in the DC region are row house neighborhoods. That's something that's very common. And if we see in places like Baltimore and Philadelphia, you see these very characteristic skinny neighborhoods, right? These skinny row houses. These are barely 15 feet wide. This allows you to put lots of row houses on a block, each one of them housing a single family or a group of people living together. These are mostly prohibited by things like lot widths and setbacks that we have today. One of the other characteristics of pre-zoning neighborhoods is that we used to integrate housing and neighborhood-serving retail. So having a ground floor, a coffee shop, a restaurant, having a corner store or bodega, some sort of service that people in the neighborhood use day after day would be built on the ground floor with apartments above it. We would have corner stores. So people don't have to drive to do all of their daily errands. You can walk. This creates a nice sense of community and allows people to engage. And this is also great for small businesses. The kind of thing we used to do pre-zoning, now we don't allow residential in commercial areas and we don't allow commercial activity in residential neighborhoods, right? We separate these uses out. Some of the people who are advocating for keeping our zoning rules the way they are will say, don't impose a one-size-fits-all solution on me. But what we actually have right now is a one-size-fits-all solution in most of our zoning. You are not allowed to build houses of different size, different structure type. What we've imposed now is this regulation that all of the houses have to be the same distance from the street and the same distance from one another, the same height. They have to have a 2-car garage of off-street parking so that we don't have extra people parking on the street. So what we have created are zoning rules that result in very homogeneous neighborhoods. The structures are exactly alike. And guess what? If the structures are the exact same size and built at the same time and have the same features, that limits the diversity of incomes of people who can live in our neighborhoods and communities. So if you have to be able to buy a house that's the same size, if you have to be able to pay for $1 million house to move into a neighborhood, we are not going to have a diverse community. The only way we get a diversity of people is by allowing a diversity of structures in the same neighborhood. Next one, please. So it's important when we think about the policies that need to change to understand that zoning is not just a piece of paper that is written down that lives on the county website somewhere. Yes, there are legal rules that we have to follow, but this is also very much about the political process that we have created by which housing is approved and produced. And in particular, local governments who have the primary authority over giving approval for new housing production, local governments have chosen to defer a lot of their authority to long-term existing residents who are already in the community. We have an engaged community process, which was created for good reasons, right? We can think back to the urban renewal projects of the 1960s, where low-income and minority neighborhoods were torn down and replaced by highways. Out of that came the push for communities to have a greater voice in what happens, to be able to say, I don't want my house torn down and replaced by a highway. So there are good intentions behind this. But we have now gone to the point where existing residents, long-term homeowners in a neighborhood, essentially have veto power over any kind of development or changes that they don't like. And it turns out often long-term homeowners don't want any change at all. They don't want any new development. They don't want new people moving into the neighborhood. Nothing can change. We have locked up our neighborhoods in amber. So the question we're facing now is, how do we still protect vulnerable communities and give them a chance to speak up and engage in their community process, but not freeze development altogether? And it's important to understand that many of the arguments that came from a very progressive standpoint, the environmental movement, the civil rights movement, have essentially been co-opted by wealthy, highly educated white neighborhoods to stop exactly the kinds of progressive causes that we should be pushing for. And when we see these arguments used in bad faith, it's important to call them out and say, we are not meeting progressive goals. The existing zoning regime is entrenching racial and economic segregation, not helping to push back against it. So I've talked so far about the problem of not building enough homes and about these rigid rules that constrain the kinds of homes we can build. I want to make a little bit of a pivot and talk about a slightly different affordability problem, because it's important to understand these as two slightly separate issues. Low-income families everywhere in the United States can't afford to pay for market rate housing without a subsidy because their incomes have not kept up with the cost of housing. So this is not just a problem in expensive places like Arlington, this is even a problem in rural areas that have been losing population for decades. This is an issue in cities like Baltimore and Detroit and St. Louis where housing is objectively quite cheap. This is a problem of very low incomes, and this is true for about the poorest 20 to 25% of households. They just don't earn enough money to pay for the rent, right? So even a nonprofit organization that builds and runs affordable housing has to collect enough in rent to pay for the operating costs. Many households can't afford to pay more than about $300 or $400 a month in housing, and that's just not enough to operate and maintain affordable housing. So it's important to understand this is a slightly different problem. The solution to poor people not being able to afford housing is to give poor people more money, right? And this is primarily a responsibility for the federal government, which has deeper pockets. Arlington can't afford to pay for subsidies for all of the poor households who live here currently, nor should it have to, right? But the solution to low incomes is to give poor people money, and part of what we're trying to do is find this balance of build more homes, more rental homes, and then also provide the financial support for low-income households so they can afford decent quality housing. The quality issue is really important too. We know in this region we have a lot of older homes that are not in great shape anymore. That's where a lot of poor households live because that's what they can afford. But many of them have environmental toxins. They are not in great shape. We see families who are overcrowded in space because that's the only way they can pay the rent. And this is not great for kids to grow up in, right? We have millions of families with children who are living in poor quality housing or overcrowded housing or in places where they don't have access to economic opportunity. These are our workforce of the future, right? These are our citizens of the future, and all of us need to be investing in better quality housing for children. So the flip side of not building enough homes in the right place is that we've built too many homes in the wrong places. And to put this into a regional context, the homes that we're not building in Northwest DC on top of the metro, that we're not building in Arlington, that we're not building in Bethesda and Silver Spring, it's not like those homes don't get built. They get built far out in the exurbs. More than half of our housing since 2000 has been built in places like Prince William and Loudoun and Frederick County. Guess what? The carbon footprint of a household in Prince William is much bigger than the carbon footprint of a household in Arlington. These are low-density, car-dependent neighborhoods where people have to drive everywhere, and people have much, much longer commutes to get to work. So the environmental impact of building all of our homes far away from downtown centers and far from transit is much worse than building in the urban core. We in the DC region are relatively lucky compared to, say, the West, where they are also building most of their homes in places that catch on fire. We have seen the recent hurricane in Florida. We have built far too many homes in places that get hit by hurricanes, and we know this will happen over and over again. So we have to balance the environmental impact, build more in the right places, and build fewer homes in the wrong places. Homeownership has been a great way to build wealth for households who are able to access that, and the US has leaned very heavily on homeownership as a form of wealth building, but we also know that this has been incredibly inequitable across our country's history. So until quite recently, Black and Latino households could be denied a mortgage simply because they were Black or Latino, right? That was legal until the 1968 Fair Housing Act, and there are still enormous disparities in who has access to a mortgage, in the interest rates that people are charged, in the ability to buy homes in high opportunity neighborhoods. So the reliance on homeownership is in fact the core of the racial wealth gap in this country. Fewer than half of Black and Latino households own their own home. For white households, this is more than 70%. And even if we look at households who own their own home, white households have roughly twice as much home equity as Black and Latino households. So this is the entire racial wealth gap. It's also important to understand that even if we were to get Black and Latino home buyers into homeownership tomorrow, that wouldn't erase this difference in home equity. This past racial wealth gap, which is accumulated over generations, is going to take more aggressive forms in order to solve it. We certainly know if we look at the history of redlining, zoning is only one of the more recent policies that has created an entrenched racial segregation. So if we look at the map of places like Richmond, for instance, we can see that places that were systematically denied access to capital in the 1930s still suffer deficits in things like their tree canopy and in access to parks. So many of the neighborhoods that have been historically excluded from capital still have fewer resources and less public investment today, right? It's important to understand that we want to change zoning and our approval process for housing. That is only one of the policies that has contributed to racial and economic segregation. Local governments have so many important roles to play in the housing production process, and it's important to understand that they also have a fiscal stake in this. Local governments rely heavily on property taxes to pay for things like schools and parks and a fair amount of local transportation. And so local governments are put into this position of considering every proposal for new development. How much is this going to bring in terms of additional property tax revenues? How much is this going to cost in terms of the residents' use of public services? And there is very much a perception that rental housing, denser housing, and especially subsidized affordable housing is a drain on the pocketbooks of local governments. So if we think about just the math of this, local government has a choice between a subdivision with $1.5 million homes. Each one of those will bring in more in property taxes than, say, a modest condo building with studio apartments. On the other hand, we also know that big single-family houses are much more likely to have families with kids who go to public schools. And in fact, many of the smaller apartments are occupied by 1 or 2 person households, and they often do not put that many demands on public services. So this is a conversation that often gets twisted, where we assume that it's more expensive to build affordable housing, and it's not clear that the research backs that up in many cases. In order to fix all of these problems, we will need systemic policy changes. Local governments who write the rules of housing production need to make it easier to build more diverse housing, more moderately priced housing, entry-level homeownership, and rental housing, particularly in high-opportunity communities. State governments have an important set of roles that they can play as well to incentivize local governments to do more. We are seeing some interest in Richmond, the state playing a more active role in this. In some ways, the state requiring local governments to plan for and to build local housing can also take political pressure off local elected officials. And states can also help with the infrastructure costs to make sure that those are borne regionally rather than entirely locally. The single most important thing the federal government could do would be to provide financial assistance to all low-income households across the country. Only the federal government has deep enough pockets, and this is a nationwide problem that needs to be dealt with. Unfortunately, the Biden administration's proposal to expand housing vouchers did not make it into their recent legislation. It's helpful that we're at least talking about this conversation, and they may have another bite at that at some point. None of the policy solutions that I suggest in my book are original, I hate to reveal. All of these are ideas that have been floating around, and in some cases for many, many years. The problem is not that we don't know what better policies look like. The problem is that the politics are wicked hard. So I pulled a couple of quotes. You probably can't read the top one here, but this is from one of the op-eds to the Washington Post saying that Arlington's missing middle proposal would be very bad for trees, and therefore we should vote against this. Charlottesville has actually successfully passed a change to their zoning law after some really bitter and hostile fights about what the impacts would be on racial segregation. Charlottesville, of course, is having a lot of conversations about this. So we see all over the country very similar kinds of political conversations, deeply entrenched interests who will not accept change of any kind, even though there are clear needs for this, and it would be beneficial for a lot of people. I wrote the book in part to reach not just people who are willing to come out on a Wednesday night for a talk about affordable housing. My guess is that in many ways, you don't need to hear this from me. You know this already. You are here, you are in the fight, you are engaged in this in your community. But in order to make policy change in most communities, we're gonna need people who don't currently show up on Tuesday night. We're gonna need people who think this is not my problem. Right, so in some sense, we need the median suburban homeowner who thinks, I like my house, I like my neighborhood, why should I get involved, why is this my problem? We need them to understand that it is their problem, right? And I think there are a couple of arguments we can use to make that. One is regional labor markets need places for workers of all incomes to live, right? I mean, we don't just need places for people who work in lobbying firms and well-paid law partners. We need places for baristas and housekeepers, for childcare workers, for public school teachers. They should be able to live close to their job for regional labor markets to work, right? I'm sure that Arlington Public Schools is having problems retaining school teachers because they can't afford to live nearby, right? So this is important to our regional labor market. The climate impacts are undeniable. If we continue to build horizontally going farther and farther out, instead of building on top of our transit system and close to jobs, we will have worse local air pollution, we will have worse climate impacts, and all of us are paying the cost of that. Right, and the third argument is we need to be investing in better neighborhoods for kids, high opportunity neighborhoods. Arlington has fantastic public schools. More kids should be able to go there and take advantage of them, and that's an obligation that we have to the next generation. So thank you for inviting me to talk. I look forward to Carmen's comments, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from you about the conversations that you're having in your daily work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. And you can see that she has a real gift for taking housing policy and synthesizing it and making it clear and actionable. And we're so grateful that your book is in the world and that you're here with us today. When we were putting this Leckey Forum together as an AHS board, we thought it was really important to also hear from a local practitioner, to have the academic and the research perspective, but also the local Arlington perspective. And so we welcome Carmen Romero to give us this.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And first, I want to congratulate Jenny on a wonderful book that for anyone who is interested in the topic, is a newbie to affordable housing, or for folks who live and breathe it like all of us do on a regular basis, you know, this book is a how-to actually fix the problem. My colleague Brian Goggins said to me, oh my gosh, let's look at the to-do list on table of contents. This is really basically it. So for all of you all who haven't bought the book yet, I really highly recommend it. And I'm here because I was asked to read the book and then share some perspectives, and I'm going to do that from 3 different vantage points. One, as a 25-year resident of Arlington, what it feels like on the ground to live here and experience the housing crisis that we're in as I was first a renter when I arrived and later became a homeowner in 2003, as well as my perspective as a builder, developer, but also as a leader of a nonprofit that has 43 employees and that houses 4,000 people in our properties tonight in Arlington. And lastly, as an advocate who in 2017 APA went from just serving Arlington to being called to go regional, and we're now in 5 jurisdictions. And it's been a really great learning experience for us as an organization about the tools, the challenges, and the importance of a regional approach to this problem. We can't solve this problem just at the borders of Arlington. So I'm going to start first as my perspective on the book from a builder, developer, and a nonprofit. In essence, the book talks a lot about where you need to build housing, the importance of building them in high opportunity areas. And I would say every corner of Arlington is a high opportunity area. We have incredible transit, wonderful schools, access to healthy food, jobs. It is truly part of the reason why we have a housing crisis. We're a victim of our own success. The median single-family home prices that we all know well, the 1.1, 1.2 million at this point, and it's truly a supply-side issue in Arlington. The good news is, and I think we all know this, Arlington is also a leader in smart growth. And the work that we've done in the RB corridor and on the Pike, and that we're talking about doing in Lansing Boulevard, is a shining light to others in the country and in the region that are looking at the bold steps that we have taken and finding inspiration. So I do want to tell you over and over and over again in every room I'm in, people ask, you did what with an acre? Queens Court, 1 acre of land is now 250 units. Gilliam Place, 1.3 acres, are now 173 homes, 1 acre, and then an outdoor worship garden. The Springs tore down a 27-unit building, 104 units. Over and over and over again, we have had the tools as a community to reimagine and re-envision. Now, the hard part is the length of time it takes. I mean, Queens Court took 10 years. Gilliam Place took 5-6 years. I mean, every single one of these is multi-year planning studies, rezonings, competing for county funding, competing for state funding, finding the financing agent. It literally, and you can only apply for financing 1 day of the year in Virginia. It's March. And if you lose that year, you gotta wait a whole other year. So while there's so many amazing things about Arlington, and it's not unique to just Arlington, we can't get ahead of it when it takes that long. And it also costs a lot. To get a rezoning in Arlington costs $1 million. And that's only to get to a very early set of design documents. To pull a permit at Terwilliger Place, APA had to invest $5 million from our balance sheet. And then guess what? It was a month. We closed on May 6th, 2020, 60 days after COVID hit. And our banks all wanted to pull out. They wanted to nullify our commitments because they weren't sure what was going to happen with the pandemic. There needs to be a better way, because it is impossible for us to meet the demands if we have to risk it all, literally risk it all, to bring a project like this forward. One thing I believe this county has done well is support our faith-based partnerships over and over and over again. We are standing in a testament to that, where Arlington County went all the way to the Supreme Court of Virginia to stand with our faith community. At Gilliam Place, they stood with us as well. You know, we were going to be designated historic building, and the HARLB sided with the church, that they got to decide their destiny, and that a church is more than a building, the church is the people. And in Arlington, they did it again in CUMC, a church that had taken a risk, mortgaged their land, $4 million in pre-development. They were in debt. Prior to APA being selected to step in those shoes, and Arlington doubled down. They did not let CUMC down. Brian is running that project. It finally closed, and I think they were at that for 20 years, from start to finish. It's just too hard. I mean, that is really the reality. But I have many of you in this room to thank for standing by us to make sure that we have been able to do what we've done in this community. So there's a huge debt of gratitude to Pat and the members of Voice who, you know, midnight will be there with us at the zoning hearings, making sure that the stories are not, we are not going to be held hostage to the single-family home owners who don't want us there. We're going to bring in the voices of the people that want to be in the light and living in Arlington in these areas of opportunity. And thanks to Voice, they help us do that. At a regional level, I talked about how we expanded in 2017. One thing I'm very happy about is I think housing is actually on the agenda. That's one silver lining that's come out of COVID, the essential worker, people realizing you can't stay home if you don't have a home in the midst of a pandemic. And never before have I seen resources like this be dedicated to housing at the state. Finally, we have a state housing trust fund with the help of Alfonso Lopez and others who've advocated to make that a real tool for you know, all affordable housing statewide. But on the federal level, there are big changes that, you know, have already come out of the Inflation Reduction Act. We didn't get everything we wanted in Build Back Better, but we do have hope that more help is coming. I'm a firm believer, and I don't know if this is going to be popular, it's a bipartisan issue. I don't want housing to be a partisan issue because guess what? Everyone should care about housing. And we really applaud efforts in some of our regional and national partners in this work with us who are working on both sides of the aisle to bring people together to try to move the ball forward, because that's the only way we're going to have change at the federal level is if we manage to do that. The book talks about this being a supply problem in demand communities should increase both the total amount and the diversity of housing stock. I could not agree more. For 80% of our county to be single-family home zone does not make sense to me as a resident and as a practitioner. I have a fantasy. APA does not do single-family homes, but in my dream, we will someday, or at least partner with someone who's doing it and help do a demonstration project. But you know, we're in the midst of a strategic plan. We just started, and there are different things we can do. We can help people build down payments. We can help find a piece of land. We can help secure funding. So I don't know where we'll end up on that journey, but I do think measures like the missing middle that would make it possible to do something like that are incredibly exciting to me. The regional need for affordable housing is well documented. The Metropolitan Council of Governments, the Urban Institute, we need 375,000 units of housing in this Washington, D.C. region to be built by 2030. 75% of that has to be at transit and needs to be affordable. Those are big, big numbers, and I think that's our biggest failure as a region. People are independently trying to solve this. Arlington is actually in the lead with DC. DC's put real money behind it, and they are recently moving zoning changes to try to diversify where they're building affordable housing in the wards that don't have it today. But it's really DC and Arlington, and Fairfax, under the new leadership of Jeff McKay and others, have really done incredible things over the last 2 years. You haven't seen those numbers hit yet, and I was talking to Jenny before this, and she was remarking on differences that she sees in the jurisdictions. There's a lot happening in Fairfax. I'm thrilled that the biggest jurisdiction in Virginia is put housing on the agenda under Jeff McKay's leadership. So that's exciting to see, and believe it or not, Loudoun County is very supportive. We just finished our first project there in Loudoun County. We're working on another 2-phase project. So other parts of the region are looking at things we did here, the car-free diet, reducing parking ratios, permanent supportive housing. How does Arlington do it? Again, another best practice that we have here in Arlington that we can share with our jurisdictional partners. So lastly, I guess as a resident of Arlington, when we talk to our residents, and we have the privilege of having a really robust resident services program that convenes our residents in all, from out of our 4,000 residents, roughly 2,000 of them are under the age of 25. So we do a lot of work with families around summer camps or after-school programs or college access programs, and it's such a wonderful opportunity to meet the families when they come in. And we ask them, what are your goals? And there's so much, this is their community, and there's this misconception, I feel, in this narrative that we see in Arlington, especially these days, right? That it's all about the homeowner, it's a single-family homeowners community. No, it's actually, there are 4,000 people that call APA home. This is their community too. They belong, they work here, their kids go to school here, and I wish there were ways that we can better infuse the resident voice into that civic conversation, and I know we've tried, the county has tried, and I think a big part of it is coming to our buildings, coming to our events, being in community. Why are we waiting for people who are working 2 or 3 jobs, who are, trying to work and care for their child and pay rent? Because even in affordable housing, the rent is sometimes still too high. I'm gonna be honest, we are building as many 30% as we can subsidize, but to Jenny's point, and thank you for making this point, because it's gotta be said, There are operating expenses, there are mortgages, and we do need tools to right-size the rent so that half of this country, literally 44 million renters in the United States, half are rent burdened. And we need, there's an income part of this equation that your book and that you talked about in your remarks that's very, very relevant to how we're gonna fix this problem, because we were not gonna build our way out of this. That is absolutely the case. So with that, I'm ready. I know we're gonna chat and have a more interactive discussion, but thank you for letting me give my perspectives on the book.
Okay, let's try this out. Yes, that works. Well, what a fantastic conversation, and we so appreciate both of you being here. Just a reminder that if you have a question in the audience, you're welcome to hold it up. We're going to have Charles collecting those, and that if you're online, you can put them in the chat online, or you can send it to contact@allianceforhousingsolutions.org. And while you're doing that, I have a few questions to get the conversation started. Oh, and we have more microphones coming. Great. So, Jenny, you make it clear in your book and in your remarks today that housing justice and racial justice are connected. How do both of you believe that we can bring more people into understanding this connection?
So I think, is this on? So I think a big piece of it goes back to talking about the history. Some of us live and breathe the housing space all the time, and we know the history of housing discrimination. We know that the federal government prohibited mortgages from being made not just to Black and Latino families, but in majority Black and Latino neighborhoods for a long time, right? And so there was this history of redlining, a history of racially exclusive covenants, which is present in the DC region as well, that as those were rolled back, that was actually the era when we saw zoning become more restrictive. So communities made it harder to build apartment buildings and rental housing, instituted more of these kind of discretionary approval processes at the time that the legal restrictions on racially restrictive lending were being passed at the time that the Fair Housing Act went into effect. And so you can see this throughput across generations, across 200 years really, of how communities have used different legal tools that were available to them at the time to keep neighborhoods exclusively white and exclusively upper income. And this is only the latest iteration, explaining the history behind the racial wealth gap, right? This is very much about an intergenerational transmission of wealth. If your parents and grandparents owned a home, they were able to help you make the down payment on your first home. We see this, that white first-time home buyers get a gift from parents or grandparents to help them do this. Black and Latino first-time home buyers don't, because their parents and grandparents weren't allowed to become homeowners and they haven't been able to build this up, right? So this is not about, that we are facing a new problem. We are still trying to rectify generations, centuries old discrimination, and there is an obligation to make up for the wrongs that the federal government has imposed, right? This is a problem that in large part was created by public policy, that was enforced by public policy, and if the government created the problem, the government has an affirmative obligation to help.
So in terms of our perspective at APA, our work in Ready, Racial Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, APA starts from within, right? It's important that the leadership at APA, senior staff throughout the organization, our board, reflect the diversity of the people that live at APA properties. And I'm thankful that we've been able to bring in new perspectives into our work over the course of the last 2 years. And it's been important to bring new eyes to how we were doing things. And one of the critical things that my colleague Marquand, who moved here from Detroit in the pandemic to design our resident programs, we need active intervention to break cycles of wealth disparity. We need individual development accounts with matched programs from dollars from, and we're launching one with Bank of America, Capital One, Northrop, and the Arlington Federal Credit Union this month. It's only 50 people. We're hoping to expand it after we get the demonstration going. We need to have pathways into college, right, through education. And one thing, we're working with right now that we launched is the Latino Higher Ed Network in Virginia, is bringing college counseling to APA community rooms in Spanish. And I was at the kickoff, I'm Latina, I'm an immigrant. The parents literally were in tears afterwards, coming up to us talking about, well, my child goes to this high school in Arlington, and there was no one in the counseling office to speak Spanish. My child is a junior and senior, and I have all these questions about how this is going to work and how I'm going to pay for it and what's going to happen. And we said, we've got you. Like, we're going to meet every month. We're going to help you get through that. That's our answer, I think, is, if someone intentionally redlined people from accumulating wealth, well, then we've got to actively intervene to remedy it. As a developer, we're building big buildings. Well, you know what? We should make sure that our vendors are diverse and that our JV partners are diverse. And we are literally just starting that. We're at the survey stage with ourselves as well as our property managers. And then from there, we can go set real goals.
We talk a lot about things that need to change. We'll just take a moment now, and I'd love for you to name some of the strengths that we have in Arlington that we can continue to leverage for change.
So Arlington has all of the elements that make people want to live in a community. Arlington has a great job center, right? This isn't just a bedroom community where people commute into DC. You have fantastic job centers, public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector. Arlington has one of the best transit networks anywhere in the country. I mean, the corners of Arlington that have the least public transit are probably better than 90% of American neighborhoods, and that's really remarkable, right? We have a fantastic transit system, both the county one as well as WMATA. Arlington has amazing neighborhoods. I mean, it has beautiful housing of all sizes and shapes. It has lots of local businesses. It has amazing restaurants and corridors of all kinds. And, not just the Metro corridor, but the Columbia Pike area and South Arlington. It has an incredibly diverse population along every kind of dimension. So, Arlington it's a mini city, although I know it doesn't like to think of itself that way sometimes. But Arlington has all of the assets and amenities. It also has really strong community institutions. You have a strong nonprofit community. You have a very strong public sector. I mean, the Arlington County Planning Department, gets national awards for the things that they do. My observation from living across the river is that you have elected officials who get that there is a problem and want to do the right thing, and you have a lot of really engaged citizens who are willing to show up and put their weight behind it. So that's fantastic.
Absolutely. I would say what we've been able to observe and see over and over again is leadership, and I do think our county board has been incredibly supportive, and housing's been on the agenda in Arlington for 20 years. And certainly in the last 12 years that I've been involved in it, we've taken an acre, and I told you, if you can go 250 units on an acre, that is unheard of, really unheard of. And it takes political fortitude. You have to be thinking of the new residents that are coming into Arlington to make those tough decisions. And over and over and over again, at the end of a project, it just happened at Terwilliger. Someone who was really unhappy during the process came to the grand opening. We had an open house. They came in with their child and were touring the unit and said, you know what? This is actually really nice. This is beautiful. This is going to be, this is going to be just fine. And I see it happening over and over and over again. But for the political will of our elected officials, and I'm not saying that just because Matt's here, we wouldn't have created those 1,000 units that we have in the last decade, and I'm very grateful for that.
So we already have a stack of questions on a range of topics. We'll start off with, how do we design a planning system that better represents renters and future residents?
So I'll share something that I heard last week. I was at a conference up in Boston and talking to my favorite group of political scientists at Boston University who study the engagement process. And they have done a bunch of research looking at the demographics of people who come out to traditional community meetings to engage. And what they find consistently is that the people who come on Tuesday night to a planning board meeting are older, they're whiter, they're wealthier, they're more likely to be homeowners than the community at large, right? So they're not representative of voters or residents in the community, right? It's a selective group. But it turns out there are ways that you can engage people who don't feel comfortable coming out to a community meeting, or people who can't come out, right? They have kids they have to take care of, they work second shifts. So figuring out how to engage them is really important. And one of the ways that one of the Boston suburbs has done this is by doing very targeted focus groups. They did a whole focus group for renters. So they sent out mailings to apartment buildings saying, we want to have a focus group just among renters to talk about your vision for the community and how you do that. They did focus groups for young adults who often don't feel like they've been here very long. They may not feel like they're welcome with the long-term homeowners. So they invited just a focus group of younger adults. They did a focus group of older adults who also have distinct views on the community. So they did a bunch of these focus groups around special interests, and the people who came out to the focus groups not only look different than the people who come to the big community meetings, they have different opinions. And when you get them in a group and let them talk, also a smaller setting that's not as antagonistic, where people get to engage, they get to say, and they ask questions like, what's your vision for the future of the community? What are the kinds of things you value? What are the kinds of things you want? And then you get a much fuller picture of that, right? This is really helpful for elected officials because then they know it's the people who come out to the regular meetings aren't the entire community, and they're not presenting you with all of the viewpoints. And so that kind of really intentional reaching out to the community process can be very valuable.
And I completely agree. I think we need to go different places to ask those questions. Focus groups are a great idea. You know, we recently were trying to get input from our residents across the portfolio into our strategic plan, and we hired a consultant to design a survey to ask questions about how we were meeting our mission and other opportunities. And, you know, it was 5 or 6 different events that they were already going to be at. It was the summer luau, it was the back to school supply pickup, it was, you know, a public health meeting, it was a food distribution. You need to go to different venues, and people were happy to share their feedback. And I was, you know, pleasantly surprised because often, you're right, I've been to many public meetings in Arlington, it's usually the same folks.
So what role does access to big capital play in the deficit in housing production?
That's a tough question. That's especially a tough question at the moment, given what's happened in interest rates. I mean, the private financial markets do most of the heavy lifting in paying for housing development and in providing capital for individual homeowners. You know, more than 90% of homes that exist in the US were built by private sector developers, are owned either by owner occupants, who are, you know, private entities, or owned by private landlords. So, you know, the private market has done a good job of providing enough housing, and the lack of capital is not the main problem, right? It's not that you can't get a loan, or that the big apartment developers can't access capital markets in order to build, but there's a limit to what private capital can do to provide housing that's affordable to low and particularly very low income households, right? And we haven't talked that much about sort of the distinction between kind of low income and very low income and the types of subsidies. You know, the private market should be able to take care of middle to upper income households, as long as we allow them to build and don't make them take 10 years to build an apartment building, right? 10 years to build an apartment building makes the apartments more expensive. There's just no way around that, right? So cut the time down to 7 years or 5 years, your rents will go down, and that's something to, to keep in mind. What the private markets can't do is build housing that's going to rent for $300 a month, right, to people who have very low incomes. And for that, we have to have a subsidy that has to come from the private sector, preferably from the federal government, because that's where most of the money can come from. But there are a bunch of ways that we can come up with a subsidy, and we can provide this directly to households. We can provide this to developers in the construction process or with ongoing subsidies. But there's a limit to how far you can get the rents down unless you have government money.
In terms of capital, the capital tool that has built the most affordable housing in this country was designed in the 80s, the low-income housing tax credit, and really has not been expanded really since the 80s. And in fact, they increased it by 12.5% for 5 years during tax reform, but that's now elapsed. So we actually have less tax credits now to go around than we did 5 years ago. Couple that with interest rates have doubled, right, in the last few months, and construction costs have probably gone up 20%. It's about to get a lot harder to do what we've been doing the last 10 years in a much better economic time. The only way out of this is going to be some real investment on the federal level and on the local level, and groups like Amazon that have stepped up with their $2 billion of very, very, very low interest debt that's subordinate to other tools is also been very helpful, and hopefully other companies will join them in doing investments like that. But I guess that's it. We are nervous. You could see all of this work that we've all done to put housing on the agenda and make people realize that we have a problem, and finally getting the region to start working together to move it forward may just bring everything to a grinding halt for the next 18 months. So we have to be committed as a community to say we're not going to let that happen and are going to need help.
So in terms of federal assistance to consider, and in the interest of giving poor people the money, do you support the idea of a guaranteed income program? Why or why not? And we know Jenny has written about that, so we'll start with you.
So I'm in favor of getting cash to poor people in whatever way we possibly can, and I'm not picky about the way that we do it. The way we've currently provided the biggest housing subsidy program is through housing vouchers, which are very, very effective, right? We have lots of research to show that it is literally life-changing for families to get a voucher. It provides them stability. It allows them to spend more of their income on things like food and health care for their kids. So vouchers are an incredibly effective tool. There are limits to vouchers, in part because a lot of landlords choose not to participate. Not necessarily because they don't want voucher holders as their residents, but because it's more complicated to work with government entities than not. And sometimes the federal government does things like shut down, and then it stops making voucher payments. So it's not totally crazy for landlords to prefer kind of the simpler version, right? So one option is if we just gave people cash rather than a voucher, there would be some people who would be able to rent an apartment who can't do that with the voucher program, right? We can also, though, just get people cash in other ways. So the expanded child tax credit was also, it turns out, very, very effective in helping families who need that money, right? You had to have a kid to be eligible, so households without children did not get it. But for families with kids, that was great. And they spent more money on things like rent and food and healthcare, which is all fantastic. And I wish Congress had continued that. A universal basic income, the tricky question is whether it would supplement existing programs or replace it. And so the design of this would be really important. If we take away all the existing programs, you'd have to give a lot more in cash. I also think in practice we are not going to get to a universal basic income where we give everybody money. That would be phenomenally expensive, and I don't see any political will for this. But there are a bunch of great pilot programs giving monthly stipends, cash stipends, to a small group of families, and so far the evidence is very encouraging on that this is really helpful. It takes off a lot of financial stress. People are able to make better planning around their budget month to month when they have some cash and have some flexibility. So I would love to see philanthropy step in and do more of these pilot programs so that we can make the case for expanding them.
I would say, to me, the voucher route feels like the cleanest in the sense that we can get to scale quickly. My only fear with the guaranteed income pilots, I think that's wonderful. I think we should do that too. But really, you can't wait. Right now, you have to wait 8 years to get a housing choice voucher, right? Thank God Arlington has, again, something that Arlington does that is amazing, is the Arlington Housing Grant Program. Most jurisdictions in the DMV do not have that, right? But the federal government needs to expand that tool so that everyone who needs it has it. And then we can legislate to make landlords have to accept it.
Are there examples in America where missing middle policies have been implemented?
Yes. The last 4 or 5 years, we've actually seen a ton of experimentation by both local governments and state governments. So Minneapolis was the first city to legalize duplexes and triplexes in all its residential neighborhoods. Did that through its comprehensive plan in 2019, and they have still been rolling that out. California has legalized accessory dwelling units statewide. It took them a couple of tries to sort of close off all the backdoor loopholes, but it is now legal, and California has built 60,000 accessory dwelling units since they legalized it. So, you know, California's a big state, but not like 60,000 accessory dwelling units. That's not nothing. They also last year legalized duplexes across the country and legalized lot splits. So a single family lot, and if you add these two things together, a larger single family lot, you can split into 2 lots, and you can put a duplex on both, or you can put an accessory dwelling unit, and actually they have 2 accessory and then a junior accessory dwelling unit. So you could potentially put 4 to 6 units on what now has 1 house, right? And in a lot of configurations, the nice thing about this is you can do, you know, a cluster of little cottages. You can do them as 1 stacked house. You have a lot of flexibility in the design. We are seeing other states, interestingly, Montana and Utah are 2 of the states that are pushing hardest on legalizing missing middle statewide, because both of them have really severe housing crises. So we are seeing a lot of experimentation up and down both of the coasts, Maine, Massachusetts, all sorts of experiments going on. Virginia is not quite there yet at the state level, but there's no reason that Arlington can't go ahead and do this too.
So a question about how hybrid or remote work has changed the conversation regarding housing cost, housing design, housing location.
Well, in some ways, it has probably exacerbated the problem in Arlington, right? Because now that people have figured out they don't have to go to their respective offices, but they can live, work in Arlington, people are doubling down. You know, they want to live here, and they, you know, have the ability to, you know, or maybe they can remote and work from, you know, Florida or somewhere else. So you have different markets all over the U.S. that are experiencing, like, there are places where people wanted to go during COVID that they can live, and I think it's really impacting a variety of housing markets nationally. And I'm sure Jenny probably knows the top 5 cities that have seen an influx, and then you have other cities like DC that are getting hollowed out, right, because people aren't coming back to work. So you have these office buildings that many now are starting to get marketed for default, right? So we're going to have a decline in places like DC if we can't get people to go back. And then you have the commercial districts there, the lunch crowd and the businesses that were set up to serve them who are going dark as well. So there's an opportunity for possible conversions to affordable housing, so maybe there's a silver lining. But that is, you know, not an area that we have moved on, but I certainly would be very interested in seeing that happen.
Yeah, and it's fascinating seeing like the main jobs corridor, both in Arlington and in DC and in places like Bethesda that also have a lot of office buildings. The office buildings are still pretty quiet, and DC has not come back to work as much as a lot of other cities have, in large part because of the federal government. But the residential neighborhoods all throughout the DMV have held up really well. And one of the things that we're seeing is people work from home, but they want to go out and get a coffee. They want to go out for lunch. They are, picking up and dropping off their kids at school. They are running errands. And so there's more emphasis on having this integration of housing and residential services close by and well integrated. There's a lot of demand for things like parks and public spaces, for neighborhood serving entertainment as well. And so I think this is a great time for communities like Arlington that have a lot of these neighborhoods and that can even make them stronger. I don't know that we want to open Pandora's box, but think about not just allowing missing middle in some of the residential neighborhoods, but maybe even allowing some corner retail, right? So that everybody should be able to walk to a corner grocery store and walk to the coffee shop, right? And those integrate really nicely with a lot of kind of smaller mixed-use buildings. One thing that I will say I'm a little worried about the DC region as a whole is we're expensive relative to many parts of the country. If people can work at their job in DC or in Arlington or in Bethesda, but they can live in North Carolina or Tennessee or Texas where housing is cheaper, some people are going to do that. So I think the DMV has a regional issue. If we don't build enough housing, some number of workers are going to choose to leave, and those are going to be pretty well-paid workers who are going to take their resources and go elsewhere, right? So I think this should be a motivation for our local elected officials. We got to step up our game, keep the amenities in our residential neighborhoods strong, and make this a cheap enough place to live for people who have choices to live elsewhere.
Couple more questions here. Well, one or two, depending on how long it takes to answer this. Any thoughts on the advantages and/or possible disadvantages of form-based code in Arlington? And could you fill us in when you're answering on form-based code for anyone who might appreciate that?
Advantages and disadvantages of form-based code. The good news about the form-based code is, those long timelines that I complained about in parts of the county. The form-based code is an acceleration tool that was used very successfully, I think, on the Pike to set the table with the community and negotiate a lot of this up front so that projects like that can actually get off the ground and moving very quickly. So I'm actually a fan of form-based code. I think some of the downside are, and I've heard the feedback, all of the buildings on the Pike look the same. Kim, are you still here? She might be gone, who heads up the Pike Partnership. So it's a tool that needs to be revisited, I think, at certain periods to make sure that we continue to make sure that everything doesn't look the same. And I know the Columbia Pike Partnership has done a good job advocating for those kind of changes.
Okay, and last question. What kind of political power needs to be built in order to make pro-housing the norm in our communities?
So one of the biggest things that would help is making sure that younger people who live in Arlington, maybe who've just moved here, get engaged in the political process. The biggest divide that I see when I go out and talk to communities and talk to local groups is the split by age. So many people under the age of 40 are renting and think they will never be able to buy a house. They look at the prices going up even before interest rates went up and say, I will never be able to save up for a down payment. I will never be able to buy. I'm going to be a renter forever. And the system that worked for my parents and grandparents is no longer working for us. I am a Gen Xer, and I will say that when I came out of college, you could move to many parts of the country, you could work for a couple of years, save up, and buy, have a down payment and be able to afford a decent-sized house. I think people of my generation and older do not understand how hard it has become And so we're inclined to think that young households are, the renters are spending all their money on avocado toast and Netflix subscriptions, and that's why they can't buy a house. And that's not it, right? They have credit card debt, they have student loan debt at rates that we never did, and housing prices have gotten up a lot more expensive relative to incomes. So young people are frustrated. They have not shown up the ballot box actively enough. But I think we should be recruiting young households to come get involved. I mean, they have a lot at stake in this matter. They're going to be around a lot longer than we are, and they are the ones who have the most to benefit from forward-looking communities.
I cannot say any better than that.
Well, again, thank you, and let's show our appreciation to our phenomenal speakers today. How lucky that we get to hear both of you. And the conversation is not done today. We know that this is a conversation that started long before us and will continue to pick up, a conversation that if you haven't yet gotten Jenny's book, you're invited to and continue in that way as well. We also, as we prepare to transition to our reception, and I'll bring Charles up for some closing remarks, we wanted to also thank today's event sponsors. And those are Arlington Housing Corporation, AHC, APA, thank you for your sponsorship, the Geary O'Hara Family Foundation, the Meyer Foundation, and Virginia Housing. And again, we want to thank our hosts, the Church at Clarendon. We want to thank Reverend Danielle Bridgeforth and the AV's support, without which none of this could happen. And now I want to welcome Charles back to the stage. And should we switch back to the lectern microphone for him, or should he use this one? Okay.
There we go. Again, it was a marvelous program. Thank you all so very much. And there's really a lot that we can take away and apply to our what we're going through here in Arlington, what we're experiencing in the region, what we're experiencing in the nation. So thank you for that. I know a lot of you are also wondering, what more can we do? Well, first, as a son of a minister, I know that when I hear good words in a church, at some point a basket has to come around. I know that. I don't have a basket, but if you are led to give in spirit and support the work of AHS, you can do so online at allianceforhousingsolutions.org/donate. Again, that's allianceforhousingsolutions.org/donate. Or even better, I know you all want to touch these at some point. If you take it out and you text at AHS to 52014, again, text at AHS to 52014, you can make a very quick donation to AHS in that way too. So, other things that you can do, let's say if you don't want to give right now, that's fine. Giving Tuesday's coming up, and it's just around the corner, and we're going to have some exciting things planned for this upcoming Giving Tuesday, so just stay tuned for that. You'll be hearing about it in your, online. And of course, as far as events are concerned, the Bosman Affordable Housing Award Celebration is scheduled for Sunday, December 4th at 6:30 p.m. Again, that's going to be Sunday, December 4th, and look again to your emails about that. Invitation should come through that way, and I'll tell you about how to get a ticket to that event. And this is going to be an interactive online event this year. So we're going to continue the online tradition that we did last year, but we're going to make it a little bit more interactive. So I really look forward to that. And if you're looking for something that you can do sooner, then a partner organization of ours, Voice, will be holding a gathering on November 17th, digging deeper into missing middle and featuring board members Dorsey and Garvey. More information about that is available out in the reception area. I will definitely be there, and I encourage you all to go too. Again, thank you for joining the Alliance for Housing Solutions for the 2022 Leckey Forum. Through your support, AHS is able to continue its efforts to increase the supply of affordable housing in Arlington County and Northern Virginia through public education, policy development, advocacy, and innovation. Have a good night. Thank you.